Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. To a longtime newsman like myself, the media world can seem topsy-turvy when a satirist like Jon Stewart commands more trust and respect than the country's most prominent network anchor. NBC's Brian Williams is facing not just a credibility gap, but a credibility chasm after fabricating a story about being in an Army helicopter that was forced down by enemy fire in Iraq. There is a lot that is radically different about this strange new media world. Newspapers are on life support, and network TV news is in danger of going the way of typewriters and carbon paper, which is what I used when I came into the business. And what are we to make about the explosion of online journalism, e-magazines and blogs of every kind, and Twitter? We'll talk about all of this and more with my guest, Les Payne, a truly extraordinary journalist. He's been a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, a celebrated and award-winning columnist, and a top editor at Newsday when it was one of America's truly fine newspapers. He was also a co-founder of NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. Les, welcome. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
My pleasure being here.
So we'll get to the latest media developments in a moment, but let's start with you. How do you get your news now every day?
I still read papers. I still go online. And I find it's more difficult. I mean, I read, well, when I was the editor of the paper, I used to read 5 newspapers every day.
Right.
I mean, and I don't read 5 every day now. I read 3 of them. I go online, and one of the things I find, thanks to internet, and the technology is great, is I can read overseas newspapers. I mean, for instance, on the Middle East, I read Haaretz, I read the Jerusalem Post. I search around on given subjects, you know, for weeklies too. For instance, on Ukraine, there's a New Jersey paper called the Ukraine Weekly, you know, which you know what that is. I mean, that's a Ukraine community's weekly newspaper, but you can find out what is on the minds of Ukrainians. So, I mean, I read broadly, but I read online.
Do you ever watch television news?
Painfully.
It has gotten bad.
I end up scanning a lot of the cable stations,
right.
You know, including this one, by the way. And,
right.
and I don't mean that in any
except
a positive
right.
sense.
Yeah.
You know, because I find it far more useful and informative than some of the network news.
What, if anything, do you still read in hard copy?
I read the New Yorker, you know, when it comes out every week. I read the New York Times.
Right.
I read the Wall Street Journal. I scan the Daily News. I have to say that.
Right.
And I won't even get into my own newspaper, but I don't read it.
Oh, is that right? Well, I scan the Daily News as well. I can't read the Post, the New York Post anymore. But you know, I used to read. I used to be a faithful reader of the tabloids.
I used to read all of them.
But in a general sense, news coverage has changed profoundly over the past several decades. How do you think it's doing? Good, bad, indifferent? What's some of your
Well, I think the best that can be said is that it's in transition. You know, the delivery of news is in transition, which is to say it hasn't hit rock bottom, and there's a great chance for improvement. And I'm hopeful.
Right.
And I'm hopeful because of generationally. I mean, the technology. I mean, the technology is such that it can be of tremendous. If we had that technology years ago, I mean, it would just be unbelievable.
Do you remember?
What you could do with it.
You'd send to the library, which they called the morgue, for the old yellowed clippings when you were trying to find background on a story. I mean,
and it's all at your fingertips.
Exactly. I have no idea how we used to do it. Yeah. We were talking about television, and it just seems to me that the Brian Williams fiasco is almost like something like that would have been a natural outcome of this convergence of news and entertainment that we've seen, especially not limited to TV, but we've seen it especially on television. Can you talk a little bit about that convergence?
Well, I think that, again, I know the newspaper business, you know, best, but what I see and observe on television is that you're right. I mean, for a while, there had been a wall, or at least a line, between news and entertainment. The news division of CBS, NBC, those networks was not considered to be a profit center. by and large,
Right, exactly.
and that they would go to an entertainment center. But now there's been a meshing of that. And I think that, for instance, I remember once when I first saw Dan Rather go on, I think it was either Johnny Carson or David Letterman, and he got in some spitting contest, and he was an anchor. And I said,
Right.
wow, I just thought it was demeaning.
Right,
You know,
exactly.
and therefore,
Right.
but it turns out that it is required for them to build their public image by going on these entertainment shows, Imus, and the late shows. And when you go on those shows, when you lay down with certain things, you wake up with certain fleas.
That's exactly right. And you make a good point. I mean, when you have to start showing a profit from the news division, then on TV you have to get those ratings, and it's entertainment or fun stuff that builds the ratings. So Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and that ilk have become not just well-known, not just famous, they're superstars, but also powerfully influential. Now, satire has had a long and honored history in journalism and literature and that sort of thing. But how do you feel about the fact that an awful lot of people, including young people, actually get their news from those kinds of sources?
Especially young people.
Especially young people.
When we both
right.
go to college campuses and you ask them where they get their news, they'll tell you almost unabashedly, that Jon Stewart and Colbert and these things. But I think that the baby boomer generation in the media have itself to blame somewhat. I mean, I think it is generational. I think that nature abhors a vacuum, and I think that there had been an increasing vacuum, in news deliveries. And I think that news had not only were the anchors and co-anchors expected to go and engage on the entertainment side, but I think entertainment began to infuse news, what passed for news, which is, say, important information to have some bearing on informing people in an interesting way. So I think that there has been kind of cross-pollination of news and entertainment, both in what is presented and in those who present it. And I think that, and into this increasing vacuum, so I mean, if the straight news person is doing this, why not go to the real entertainer and have him mesh his entertainment with news?
Right. One of the dangers of the unsophisticated viewer, of course, is distinguishing between what's fun, what's a joke, and what's news and what's serious.
Yeah, and that's the danger to journalism, and therefore that's the danger to the Republic. And as a newspaper man, I don't want to sound as if I'm, it's all TV. I mean, our business, our craft, as it were, has been corrupted in the same way. And basically, I think it's greed.
Right.
Let's face it, it's greed.
That's the bottom line.
It's greed. I mean, and I think without going to the long, gory history, the newspapers were highly profitable when they were in private hands. Corporations looked at them, and beginning in the 70s, they began to buy them up so that they could make money.
So you have had a truly distinguished career.
Fortunate.
In journalism. We've been fortunate, worked hard, and you were a brilliant journalism. But how'd you get into this racket? There's a lot of things you could have done.
Well, interestingly, we have at Queens College. I have an artist exhibit of South African artists. But when I was young, I could draw. And so and my high school teacher tried to push me into art.
This is new. I didn't realize this about you.
Yeah, a lot of my Newsday people didn't know. But I could draw an apple like an apple. Then I went to high school, and they taught you how to draw an apple that does not look like an apple. They taught you how to draw Salvador Dali apples, melting apples.
Or a Cubist apple.
Or a Picasso apple. So, but at any rate, I had a high school teacher at Hartford High, at this point in Hartford, Connecticut. And so I had a full fellowship to University of Connecticut on fine arts. They had just opened a fine arts center. But I was the first in my family to go to college. I mean, my family moved up from Alabama. I was the first to go to college. And art, I couldn't see how you could make a living. I mean, I didn't want to, most artists we knew were living on their friend's couch, sleeping on their friend's couch in Greenwich Village. So I was also luckily good in math and science, and so I ended up I majored in engineering at the University of Connecticut instead. But I always wanted to write, and I hated engineering. And so I switched my major, which really disappointed my mother, who at first didn't know what an engineer was. I think I told her when I wanted to be an engineer, she thought I was going to drive a train. But then when she found out that engineering was you know, at that point Sputnik had gone up, there was a space war, so it was a hot field.
And it was it was a big demand in
guaranteed
society.
Job, yeah. And so my junior year, I changed my major, disappointed her, but made me happy because I wanted to write. And then after that, I had to choose between teaching or the newspaper.
You became an English major?
I was an English major. I got an English major at University of Connecticut, and so it was to teach or to write. I mean, to teach or to go into the newspaper business. So I picked the newspaper business.
Right. Now, you also you went into the service. You were in the, you were an officer in the Army. Went to Vietnam. Chronologically, how did that fit in?
Well, I graduated University of Connecticut, and my generation, there was a draft, and you went.
Trust me, I was in that draft.
And so we all of my, and again, you know, we fulfill our obligation. We all went to, all of my uncles, brothers, everybody went to, so it was given that I would go into the service. So I preferred to go in as an officer. So I went as a lieutenant at ROTC, went in as an officer. And really got lucky in the sense that, you know, by some fluke, I was a air defense artillery officer, which is to say missiles, because of my math science background. But then, luckily, you know, when it came time for me to go to Vietnam, VC had no planes to shoot down, so they looked and said, what else could you possibly do? So they looked at journalism. So I in the Army, became the Army's version of a journalist, which is, say, an information officer. Right. But don't get your hopes up.
So you were essentially a reporter when you were in the Army.
Not a reporter, but a journalist.
A journalist.
We wrote. Yeah, we did report.
Okay. Oh, right. But you were in Vietnam.
I was in Vietnam as an information officer.
Right. So it's interesting because normally people think that the person who got drafted, which was me, was the one who would go to Vietnam. They just happened to send me to Korea. You volunteered and you ended up in Vietnam. Yeah. How did you get your first job in newspapers and where?
In Vietnam, as an information officer, I worked with all the journalists who came through Vietnam the year that I was there. I met them. From the New York Times, Newsday, all of them. And so I had formed contacts, and I formed a contact with someone who was at Newsday. And so when I got out of the service, boom, you know, I came to work for Newsday.
Did you?
Bill Moyers hired me, by the way.
Bill Moyers?
Bill Moyers.
Great man.
Bill Moyers was he was Johnson's press secretary.
Exactly. At a ridiculously young age. He was like in his 20s.
That's right. And he became the publisher of Newsday. He was 33 years old, I think it was.
Yep.
33 years old, he was a publisher of Newsday. And when he looked around, he saw there was no blacks anywhere in the newspaper business. And so he hired a bunch of us. He hired like 6 of us. And I was one of those 6 that he hired. I asked him once, I reminded him of that. He said, well, we all make mistakes.
Well, now, you were on a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. Can you tell us about that story? It actually was a series. Can you tell us about that?
In the early 70s, heroin had swept, you know, New York City in particular. If you check 1,100 heroin-related deaths in New York City alone, 1,100. Like the homicide rate is 500 a year, 1,100. Mainly blacks in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was a huge scourge. And it began to leak into Long Island, which is where Newsday was. It was a Long Island paper at that point. And then they said, okay, let's do something about it. So we decided, I was a young reporter at the point, but the team leader decided that let's do the whole story. Let's find out where it's grown, who grows, who make the money, how did it get here. And so we did a story. At that point, 80% of the heroin was grown in Turkey. So we went to Turkey, spent 3 months investigating, you know, who grew it, who made the money, how was it smuggled out of Turkey.
Which is what you could do in those days, spend 3 months investigating a story.
Try it today. And then we went from Turkey, there were 3 of us, and we went from Turkey to France, which is the French connection, which is where, again, the morphine was smuggled to France, turned into heroin, and then smuggled into the U.S. And then we had another team back here that was looking into those who was consumed it in Harlem and Bed-Stuy and elsewhere in the city. Right. And that long series won the Pulitzer Prize.
Now, you also covered South Africa. You went to South Africa and covered the situation then when South Africa was still in the grip of apartheid.
That's right.
Talk about that a little bit. First, how did you come to be sent or to go there?
Yeah. Well, Newsday had no foreign desk at that point. And when Hector Peterson, who was a 13-year-old, was gunned down, I mean, I was stunned. I saw it on television like most of us. It was on the front page of the New York Times. I was just, what kind of people are these that are shooting kids running away from them?
This is a South African child, yeah.
And I was a reporter. Looking for a story, by the way. I just finished a book on the Patty Hearst kidnapping called The Life and Death of the Seminole Liberation Army. And so I was looking for a project, and when that happened, bam, I raised my hand, volunteered. They agreed to send me. So I went and I covered the Soweto Uprising in 1976.
Now, what was it like, since apartheid is still in effect, what's it like for a black journalist there trying to cover this story?
They made you what they call an honorary white.
Oh, there you go.
Unfortunately, it was not reciprocal. I couldn't make them an honorary
Exactly.
white. And they had to make you an honorary white because blacks couldn't stay in hotels. You know, you couldn't go to a press conference. And there were buildings you couldn't even get. I remember once when we had telexes back then, as you remember. Mm-hmm. If you want to send a story, you would go to a telex office. Well, they didn't have a telex office for blacks. You know, only whites could go through that. In the post office, I mean, it was just real. So they would make you an honorary white so you could move around and have access.
Can you just talk a little bit about what that experience meant to you personally? What surprised you about it as opposed to what you anticipated going there? And then how it affected you subsequently?
Well, I was born in Alabama.
So you knew what apartheid was?
Yeah, I knew kind of what that was. And it was, in fact, interestingly enough, when I would talk to the boys and they would say, "Where are you from?" I wouldn't tell them New York. I would say, "I'm from Alabama." They would say, "You understand us."
Right.
You know? But, I mean, it had a profound effect on me because I think that there's a huge difference. I mean, because there the African majority, 73% of South Africa was black, and they had a claim to the land. Unlike, you know, I mean, I grew up in a minority situation. You know, we were a minority here. So it was just kind of an inverse. They had a claim on the land. The reality was different. But the thing about it is that you always knew, and I even saw that you knew that one day that would end over there. Nelson Mandela was locked away. You know, Nelson Mandela, when I was there covering it as a young reporter in 1976, you could not even mention his name. If a newspaper wrote Nelson Mandela's name in a newspaper, it would be banned. You couldn't utter his name on a conversation on television like we're talking here. Right. And if a student would have a sign with Nelson Mandela's name on it, she would be whisked away. I mean, it was a terribly, terribly barbaric situation where they were in fact shooting down children, babies even. I documented a 5-year-old who was shot in the middle of the head by a cop knowingly because she gave the Black Power salute. I mean, it was very, very brutal people. And the interesting thing about South Africa now is that the vice president of South Africa was here recently, Matlana. He was at one of the universities, and I attended, and he said, you know, in all of South Africa now, we can't find any white South African who supported apartheid.
Oh, they're gone. Right.
Not one.
Well, yeah, we were never down with that. Oh, my goodness. So, you know, in those days, you could flourish as a newspaper reporter. A young man or a woman could fashion a wonderful career, could lead a good, decent, middle-class life. Yeah. It's obviously much harder now. Yeah. Are newspapers dead? I mean, is it, you know, is this a death watch?
I think dead tree journalism, which is say you cut down trees, that's gone. I mean, I think it's going to be online.
It's all going to be online.
Delivered, I think, for the most part.
I agree, because I think even the New York Times, I think even the New York Times ultimately will become an all online newspaper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe an elite 10,000 copies and it will be read by the 1%. You know, and they walk around with it like it's gold. You know, like people used to walk around with foreign affairs.
Maybe they'll just carry it. They won't actually read it.
People used to walk around with foreign affairs, and so people would think well of you, even though you didn't read it.
Right, exactly. But you were up on it. And then, so how does one young man or woman who's interested in journalism, who wants to write or, you know, be an editor or whatever, what are the options?
I think the opportunities are wide open. I think that
you do.
I am hugely, hugely optimistic about this. You know, because of the technology, because of their familiarity with, because of the technological advantages that they have that we didn't. And what you have is that, I mean, I think the internet, forget social media, I think that basically it's a frontier situation where you know, it's like the old West. You know, students wouldn't understand it, but the old Wild West when you had no sheriff,
right?
You know, and everyone had a gun. You know, so what has to happen is that there has to be some law brought to the delivery of news on the internet. So there has to be law. I mean, the system that we learned, which is what news is, important information that people powerful want to keep secret. You have to learn how to gather. You have to learn how to verify it. You have to learn how to make sure it's not libelous. Those systems, that value system has to be imposed. That's the thing. That's what our generation has and should deliver to this younger generation. What they have, you know, and if they had that, once they get that value system, they have the technology that's unbelievable. I mean, they don't even have to go places. For instance, when I wrote a story in South Africa, if I wanted to send that story back to my newspaper, Newsday, I would have to type it out on a typewriter, usually in my hotel room or in the lobby of the hotel, take that paper out, go to the telex office, have them input it. They would send it. If I wanted to send a photograph and I had photographs, I would go to the airport, take a roll of film, give it to someone who was going on a plane to New York. It was just unbelievable. And now, bam, all
I agree. I mean, I think the technology is astounding. You know,
and once they get the value, I mean, I think the golden age of journalism is on the way.
Well,
I really think.
All right, for a golden age to occur, I presume you think that there will be some kind of breakthrough or breakthroughs that will enable whatever outlets to pay these journalists a decent income for their work.
I think so, and I think the reason why I'm so optimistic about it is because I'm optimistic about the democracy. Because without a free press and without the free, fair, unbiased delivery of information, the democracy is gone. That's why I'm optimistic, and I think that people will find a way for it to pay, and I think it will be beyond the reaches of the corporation, which is just totally about greed.
Well, then let's say that this sort of thing occurs. One of the things that I think is missing right now is the young journalists learning the nuts and bolts of reporting, how to cover a story, how to distinguish between what's a significant story and what's nonsense or whatever. How do we begin to get that on track for this wonderful new world of online journalism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think professors, you know, I mean, it's passed down from. See, journalism is a craft. You know, unlike drawing, right, which is a gift from the gods, right, and how art is a gift from the gods. I think it's a craft, and they can be taught how to do this. And it simply is, how do you get information from people who don't want to give it to you, and then how to get information from powerful people who don't want to give you that information. And you can learn that. You know, and I tell young students all the time, it's like if you ask your parents for the key to the car and they say no, that's not the end of it. You find ways to do that. Right. And reporting begins when important sources say, no, I'm not going to tell you that. And once we teach them that, once they become determined, I think that journalism will move to its highest possible level. And I think the democracy, because without it, the democracy is gone.
I completely agree. That journalism, real first-class journalism, first-rate journalism, is a cornerstone.
But students burn
of a democratic system.
Students burn with that, and it's out there. It just needs to be cultivated, and they have the technology and they have advantages, and I think it's going to work.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you, I mentioned that you were a co-founder of NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. When did that happen, and why did that have to happen? 1975,
and what we found is that there were very few. In 1975, 95% of newspapers in the country had no black employees at all. 95%.
As late as 75?
As late as 75. And, well, in the 70s in particular, right, because we ran up to it. That's when we began to talk about it. The first time we began to talk about it in 1971 in the Earl Caldwell's case. And we looked around and we said, how many at your paper? How many at your paper? And then we did surveys, and AS, American Society of Newspaper Editors, did surveys, and they found out like 95% had no black reporters at all. And not all of these papers were in little small towns in Bismarck, North Dakota. There was a point in which the New York Post, after Murdoch took over, had no black reporters
I remember
at
that.
all.
Exactly.
None.
Yep.
Zero. No editors, no photographers, no reporters. Right. None. Here in New York City. So we decided we have to organize to do a number of things. One, to increase the number of black, because without it, journalism was half-baked, incomplete totally. So we had to increase the numbers. We had to increase the treatment of those, who got in, and we have to improve the coverage. because the black community, was being neglected, as a result of access.
So we've run out of time, but I'd love to have you back because I want to talk about what's happening with black journalists now as we go forward. But Les, thank you so much. This was terrific. I appreciate it.
Right. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. According to a recent poll, an overwhelming majority of Americans believe we should be taking military action against the Islamic State, or ISIS, and nearly half want the U.S. to commit ground troops to that effort. Now, it's easy to understand why anyone would react with revulsion against the barbaric behavior of this group that revels in its kidnappings and beheadings and other acts of extreme terror. But it's also easy to say, let's go to war, when you know that neither you nor anyone in your family will be put in harm's way. There is nothing easier than being a belligerent when you know that your belligerence will be carried out by other people's children. Less than 1% of the American population is willing to serve in our armed forces. That's why so many troops have had to be recycled into the combat zones of Iraq and Afghanistan for 3, 4, 5, or more tours. Sending others off to fight wars that you want no part of is not patriotism. It's cowardice. That's all for now. See you next time.